To Morning Express. My name is Trix Ingado. Today on the show, we take a look at what's making headlines locally and internationally. And of course, later on, we shall be bringing you the very latest in stories that have made headlines here in the country. Do stay tuned. You're watching Morning Express.
Well, speaking of stories making headlines right here in the country, IMF is still featuring prominently in today's papers. You'll definitely find out more about that. In terms of the latest political realignments, the Standard has definitely got you covered. My name is Jesse Rogers. Good morning. Many thanks for making time for Morning Express. Let's get you informed.
Absolutely. And we start off with our international papers just to give us an overview of what's making headlines across borders. And as per usual, we start off in Uganda, where we're being told a gun used in mobile money killings linked to soldiers. Pretty unfortunate link right there, given that soldiers are meant to be protecting the good of the people. And that is what is making headlines in the Pearl of Africa. Why is Uganda? What happened happened in the third and last part of the series. Why is Uganda? Ernest Bazanye writes about how things did not improve even when Ugandans were finally free from colonial rule. Now, he cut off my hand when I refused to strip. Student pins suspected rapist. This is a very unfortunate story that is unfolding here. The victim has, of course, been hidden, but you can see from that picture there that this story is worth reading and getting to know what her plight is. And tracing the works of Archbishop Luanga is also making headlines right here on the Daily Monitor. Let's move on to the Citizen. This morning we're told about President Samia Suluhu's heralding the beginning of a new era. Now, President Suluhu Hassan yesterday signaled a new direction for Tanzania when she detailed issues that are expected to define her leadership style. Far from that, this is why why economic diplomacy is key to Tanzania's growth. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been directed to promote international affairs and renew relations with other countries for the country's benefit. And then President Samia also still making headlines here on the Citizen. President Samia says there is a need to review national curricula, optimism, jubilation after ban on media outlets have been lifted. Now, this is a sharp contrast to the approach that the former president had. And of course, things seem to be changing for Tanzania as days go by. Let's take a look at what's making headlines in Rwanda, and we are told painting memories of genocide in exhibitions 27 years later. Now, Kwibuka is one of is a yearly commemoration of what happened in that Rwandan genocide. Of course, this time round it is quite different because of the coronavirus. Gathering is not as usual, but various artists have used their talent to illustrate events of the 1994 genocide against Tutsis to continue telling the story of victims and survivors of the darkest time in that country's history. And it is our duty to honor, comfort the survivors. In absence of communal activities that usually happen at this time of the year, it is our collective responsibility to make an effort to reach out to genocide survivors, because this is a time that evokes painful memories for those who lived through that very, very dark time. Let's move on to the East African. And Uganda MPs to return iPads or pay for them. Clerks say some of the legislators are using the gadgets for personal business. And as you can see in that very interesting picture there, one of those legislators is playing solitaire. Brings back memories of one governor in this country that was playing solitaire in, of course, a very important function. Then AAR to shut dark clinics on rising financial woes. AAR Healthcare plans to exit Tanzania to reduce visitor numbers to its 8 clinics and financial troubles. And London airfares jump 5 times on Kenya travel ban. Travelers arriving in the UK from countries on the red list, Kenya is one of those countries, will be denied entry, while returning Britons must submit to 10 days mandatory isolation. Let's take a look at the CNN, see what's making headlines on the world stage. And US eyes eventual Iraq exit as ISIS threat wanes. Campaigners call for US to do more to hockey Putin's accountable as Navalny's health deteriorates. Navalny is one of the key opposition leaders in that country. And Dr. Sasa, the bloodbath is coming. More people will die. Find out more about that. And in Asia, we're told about how a failed journey to California aboard a Chinese junk boat led to a lifelong friendship. A very heartwarming story right there. And Jordan's king breaks silence after royal drama grips the country. Now let's shift focus to local news, and what's being covered on the headlines of the local newspapers is quite interesting this morning. As Jesse said, we are having the story of the IMF still making headlines. On the front page of the Standard, you're told IMF okays Kenya's Eurobond plan as job cuts loom, and it is a vicious cycle. The International Monetary Fund endorses plan to borrow up to 508 billion to repay other expensive loans as thousands of civil service and parastatal jobs face the axe in IMF's turf terms. And then on the Daily Nation this morning, IMF Treasury to unveil new taxes, and there are details that have been given here about that particular story. The government plans to introduce new taxes and cut back on existing tax exemptions as part of a reform package funded by the International Monetary Fund. And this is a big story that has been making headlines for a few days. We do know Kenyans have reacted in a very volatile way on social media, bombarding the IMF social sites with concerns about the Kenyan government's continued borrowing from that organization and many others. So we shall be keeping you updated on that. But right here, we're going to analyze those stories and see how they have been covered. Joining me is we will be having Dr. Pamela Odhiambo, a woman rep for Migori, later on. But Kariuki Ngunjiri is a political analyst here in studio with me, as well as Alenga Torosted, who's a communication strategist. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Sure.
Now, this is a very interesting, emotive story, and it comes close to home because of the fact that we are facing very difficult economic times. What do you make of these new angles that we're being given here? Because the loans from the IMF come with certain restrictions and certain conditions, and some of those will have these new taxes unveiled. What do you feel about this, given that Kenyans are vocally saying they are tired of seeing the government borrowing more and more money without any of that trickling down to them and them feeling the effect of that? I'll start with you, Mr. Ngunjiri.
Well, thank you very much. First of all is to acknowledge that as the world economic system is experiencing difficult times as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, different countries will always resort to different means to solve that financial crisis.
Yes.
And for Kenya, the government of Kenya has seen it operational and sustainable to go to the IMF and borrow the billions of money that we already know about, which does not speak to the last resort of doing things in any economy. But if at the moment that is the most urgent thing that the government can do, I think we need to rethink on future discourse and future participation in the borrowing of such Eurobonds. Remember, such Eurobonds or monies that are borrowed using the US dollar currency normally comes into the country with a higher price than whatever we quote because of the shifting of the dollar,
right,
or whichever currency that we use to borrow that amount of money. I take a different perspective, and this is a discourse that I think we are supposed to be having going forward. Yes, we have seen infrastructural development in the country, which has opened up areas that were closed economically. I have used Mombasa Road today, and I can already see the road that is already being built,
yes,
which could speak to some of the tangible things that we are seeing from this borrowing. However, in an economy that is poor as Kenya, we cannot try to govern ourselves with the standards of a rich country, trying to compare ourselves with countries like the United Kingdom or Japan or the US, saying that they have a GDP of, or rather a debt ratio to GDP of 77% and above. When we know the World Bank published a report 2 years ago and said for each country that has a debt ratio of 65% to GDP normally experience redundant economic growth of 2%. That is specifically where we are as a country. So I think we could support ourselves through, for example, creations of internal stronger economic mechanisms, like, for example, manufacturing,
Right,
which
right.
could offer incentives to some of the repayment of the loans that we are having. Let us not over-rely on dead capital to stimulate what we call an economic spur.
Mr. Ngunjiri, I think it's a little bit too late, don't you?
It is not too late to do the right thing. We can always revert to our senses sometimes as a country.
Okay, Mr. Lenga, I'd like him to come in on this one. Mr. Lenga, when you look at the story, one promises more taxes, the other talks of IMF okaying the Eurobond plans as job cuts loom. What comes to mind?
Trix, thank you for this opportunity and a very good morning to our viewers. There are certain things we need to understand. Most fundamental is we cannot operate without debt or foreign assistance in one way or the other. But that's not really the point. The point is, when we get these funds, how do we use them? Because that's what Kenyans are being paid with. It's very clear that when we get these monies, then Kenyans are taxed to be able to repay those loans. So Kenyans are asking, if we are being taxed heavily because of this borrowing, then we need to understand how prudential this borrowing is being used in return. So it's a very valid point that the government of Kenya needs to listen to and answer the questions that Kenyans have. Yeah. Kenyans do not really have a problem with the borrowing, but they have a problem with what use does this money get to? If you look at a few projects that have taken place since the Jubilee government took over, that's in 2013 to date, you will realize we were so much into capital projects. We were so much into projects that would not really give back into the economy to be able to repay the loans on their own. So that's a question we need to start asking ourselves. What do we borrow? If you look at countries that have risen from the dust, just like the third world countries, countries like Singapore that many people will want to quote, what kind of borrowing were they borrowing? When they borrowed, to which quarters were they sending these funds? They were probably increasing their productivity at home. They were building factories, they were building industries, and then those loans were able to pay back for themselves. But in this country, we borrow to build a structure that cannot give back into the economy. Look at the standard gauge railway. Till now, it has not broken even, and it will take even a much longer time. But then, who has to pay for that? It's you and I that have to be taxed to be able to repay those kind of loans. So Kenyans have a legitimate question that the government needs to understand and needs to resolve. And then also, we need to understand something, that the government of Kenya has been doing things without public participation, and where the citizens are not informed of what is going on, then it opens a huge door for speculations, and that is what is now happening in Kenya. The government should ask themselves, why have Kenyans reached a point where they now go to the internet, they now go and storm into meetings like those of the IMF and tell them, please stop loaning this country? It's because Kenyans do not have an avenue within their country to be able to speak about how they want their country to be governed.
Yeah, and Mr. Ngunjiri, I wanted to pose this one for you. Yes. When we had Mr. Ezekiel Mutua coming up, the Films Board, Kenya Films Board chief, coming up and saying, our power is at the ballot box. Yes. So how we vote informs how we actually get to live our lives. So when you look at this, do you think Kenyans shall be rethinking now how they actually vote and whether they'll be listening to ideologies as opposed to following popular leaders and things that actually do not matter when it comes to the actual work that a government is supposed to do?
You see, for Ezekiel, I think he's just not aware of how democracy functions, because
in Kenyan democracy or democracy in general? In
general, because every time that we go and elect our representatives and we donate the power to govern us to certain people, it is expected that we will have a contract between us as the citizens and the leadership, which will essentially act on our behalf on political affairs, economic, and bringing us together as a society. So that is a delegated duty to the leadership. So if it fails, it's up to the leadership to be held accountable. But then I wanted to bring this point across. These issues of debt, you have to understand how we got ourselves as a humanity, or rather as an ecosystem of countries, into these issues of every time, and especially in Africa and East Asia, depending on borrowing. In 1948, after the devastating World War II, there was this thing that is called the Marshall Plan, which was a construct of the United States to help countries in Western Europe. And these are countries, for example, now, as we know them, in the Northern Transatlantic Alliance, NATO, United Kingdom, which were hardly hit by a country like the Weimar Republic, now called Germany. And you see, that was only 6% of their GDP. Those were countries that were already industrialized.
Right.
And the Marshall Plan was not coming to help rebuild those countries in any way. Like I said, it was only a very small percentage. 94% of the country's GDP was doing fantastically well. So we borrowed this construct, and ever since 1948, if you calculate the amount of money that was used in the Marshall Plan, that is $5 billion. Look at what the budget of the IMF is today. It's over 300 and something US dollars.
Yes, yes.
So I don't see the logic behind us always over-relying on the argument of how the Marshall Plan was able to reconstruct Europe and then try to implant the same into a developing country like Kenya, which barely survives in the international monetary system.
Okay.
The 2008-2009 financial crisis that happened in the United States have also taught us that it is only important that a country that has a sustainable growth of over 7% growth to GDP, which is economists always like referring to the rule of 72, which Kenya is not, can over-rely on such foreign aid or such pools of money to bring herself back, and they will be able to repay that in a few years. We are not the same as those countries. So I believe up to the percentage that we are of debt ratio to GDP, we agree that we are already in it.
Yes,
so we should now construct a way forward. Look at, like my colleague said, look at avenues that can be able to develop our internal economic systems.
Yes.
For example, the ones I said of manufacturing and agriculture, so that we don't end up importing dead capital in form of loans, like he talked of the SDR.
We need to move on from that story. I do believe the consensus here is that enough is enough. I think everyone feels that way, even the Kenyans who are on social media bombarding the IMF social media pages. Now, there's a story on the front page of the Daily Nation, Power Women Driving Politics, playing integral roles, some policy and other behind the scenes. Growing number of influential women are expected to shape the 2022 succession politics. Politicians like Governor Charity Ngilu and Guru and NARC Kenya party leader Martha Karua regularly participate in strategy meetings as political alliances begin to shape up. And they have been pictured here, including Mama Ngina Kenyatta, Margaret Kenyatta, Rachel Ruto, Ida Odinga, Martha Karua, Nancy Gitau is last there. And then we also have Charity Ngilu, the governor. Now, it is interesting how this, what this page promises. But when you look into the actual story, I was expecting more of a revelation of the inner workings of how these women actually influence politics. Were you satisfied with this article, Mr. Alanga?
Let's say generally, if you look at the nomenclature on the article, it has both women that have been living very subtle lifestyles, like the Mama Ngina Kenyatta and Mama Rachel Ruto and the rest, and Ida Odinga. So I don't know how the author was pulling those that type of women and the ones who are in active politics and trying to get a story out of that.
Yeah.
But what I would want to speak to is the contribution that women have had in our politics, especially the works of the Honorable Governor Ngilu and even Martha Karua. That's a space that was really left open, and they sat into the space, even at a time when we considered the country was pretty much patriarchal, but they tried to rise, they rose into the political sphere and have been able to contribute immensely in the nature of this country, in its political space. So we encourage, and I would like other women to look at these women and also emulate the same, so that we feel our political space has a balanced opinion. Our political space has views that also articulate the women in our society, because pretty much we understand that most of the time the women are very influential in terms of peace building in this country. We've seen moments when we've been on the verge of collapse, and women who have sat behind and not wanted their names to be mentioned, but have worked something to be able to ensure that the country goes into a moment where we can now talk as brothers. We remember the contribution that has been mentioned about Mama Kenyatta's effort and Mama Ida Odinga's effort in terms of the handshake, and also other times when we have had conflict in this country. So it's something to explore, it's a space to expand, and it's a learning process for even more women in this country.
Okay, and it largely looks back at some of their achievements, which is quite right, including what you just said there with Mrs. Ida Odinga. But I would have loved to see more of how they would fit into the 2022 picture. Mr. Ngunjiri, what do you make of this article?
You see, there is a very good author I like called Adam Rutherford. He writes in his book of Humans, he says that for every second, every man that is constructed in the human setting are always looking at controlling resources and getting women. But for women in this case, I think it is different, because most of them are always looking for resources and control. You see, there is a significant rise in the number of women in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, who have gone to parliament. You talk about a rise of about 7% from 2010 to today. We have about 24% of women in the lower sub-Saharan Africa occupying seats in parliament. Of course, with Ethiopia getting the largest percentage of about 48%, which shows a shift in the paradigm that we have changed our thinking on how we view women. A few years ago, in, for example, Arab countries, women could not be allowed to drive. Women could also not be allowed to lead people. You could also see women not being allowed to take positions in the region. But I think the shift of how the world is changing and times are changing reflects even in our own country. You see, we have Governor Charity Ngiro, we have Anne Waiguru, we have people like Martha Karua, Alice Wahome, Susan Kihika, people, Gladys Wanga, people who have always been a motivation to the young girls that are growing up. And in a situation where we get ourselves more predominantly occupied, or rather public positions occupied by men, I see women now waking up and fighting for what is constructively theirs, which also projects to what the country views as one of its strategic plans and Vision 2030 and Africa's Agenda 2063. That is to have a higher percentage of women being actively involved in the activities of society.
Okay,
yes.
Okay. Let's shift gears to a very unfortunate story that has made headlines on the front page of both the Standard and the Daily Nation. And we are told about the shocking killings inside the troubled lives of a GSU officer and his wife. It's been given more prominence on the front page of the Standard. They say at around 9 p.m., this is how it happened. At around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, Pauline Wakasa arrived home from Kilimani Kilimani police station, and she worked in the traffic department and had dinner with her children. 15 minutes later, Hudson Wakise arrived at home where his wife and children had moved into only 5 days earlier, and is welcomed and even served dinner. Then a quarrel breaks out and Wakise leaves the house, only to return shortly thereafter. The couple was in the sitting room, the children in the bedroom, and the gunshots rang. The police say Wakise shot Wakasa 3 times in the chest. They then turned the gun on himself. He suffered a single bullet injury in the head. All this time, the children were in the bedroom. On page 6 of the Daily Nation, you find the same story. Police couples troubled, love ends in death. What do you make of this, Mr. Alenga? This is quite unfortunate. What does it point to in terms of our society?
It is very sad indeed when you see members of the disciplined forces behaving in such a way, because these are the same people that are supposed to protect the common person. And if they have that kind of level of intolerance amongst themselves, then you ask yourself what happens to when they meet the common person on the road, walking at night, whatever, how do they handle them? But most fundamental to discuss is the mental stability of these officers. Do they have a process they go through for counseling, especially after events they go through in their work, and everything that happens in their day-to-day life? Do we look at them as macho men who do not require any type of assistance, or do we look at them as humans with feelings and they actually need a certain level of therapy in terms of calming their mind when there is issues in their lives? Because when we look at them from that perspective, then within the police, the disciplined forces ranks, we can have a structuralized process where these officers can receive moral support, they can receive counseling on specific issues they go through on a day-to-day life. And then also, if you look at when I saw this story, I also looked at their age, the age of the officers, and I saw the man was about 32 years old. And then that now goes deep down into how we are raising our children. Are we teaching them to deal with issues like rejection? How are they dealing with them? Is it a must that when you love somebody, they have to love you till the end? And when they say no to you, you have to kill them and kill yourself? Can we reach a place where, as a country, we can be able to accept situations the way they are? We can be able to teach our children to be tolerant and to accept situations instead of just being very self-entitled that it is either my way or the highway.
Yeah.
Taking somebody's life because a relationship has gone contrary to your expectations is a very, very wrong thing that we should not entertain. But again, this puts the state of our women at a point where we have to look at our women and say, how are they faring in relationships? How is their security guaranteed in relationships? And what are the necessary steps they should take when they see a relationship is not going the right way? It is said that the victim had been threatened about 2 times by the same man that he was going to shoot her. But then what made her not really make the move to secure her, move to a secure place and seek even assistance from her employer and see how they can be able to be helped? Do their marital issues in their workplace with these officers, do they have a place where, in the employment, do they have a place where the employer can help them in terms of such issues? So those are the issues we should be focusing on, so that we do not have such a scenario coming up again. It's
Absolutely.
very sad.
It's pretty sad. It's pretty unfortunate. And when you look at the descriptions of these people, they seem like normal people who are doing okay. We have here one of the friends describing Wakise, the man, as someone who was deeply spiritual, who loved his family. And of course, nobody saw this happening. Now, Mr. Ngunjiri, what do you make of this? And how should society be dealing with conflict in the home?
There is a hypothesis that actually there are more police officers dying at the hands of depression more than in the line of duty, which is a very sad state of affairs. But let's be practical, even when talking about this stuff. It is obvious that when people fall in love, those who have fallen in love before will attest to this, that sometimes we always have an emotional breakdown and we over consistently get into love and forget ourselves as individuals. Life has to move on, no matter how we find ourselves in conflicts and so on. And so this speaks to, for example, some of the emotional distress, burnout, and depressions that are going through the minds of our police officers. Perhaps it's the right time, and I think this was constructed in the reforms, police reforms that we just heard from the Ministry of Internal Security, and the police department some times back, which I think could bring back some of this stuff together, and then we can have working, for example, psychological sectors within the police stations and such stuff. And then there is also another angle to this. Anytime that a young man finds him, or rather a young man finds himself in such a scenario, the best thing, and this is for the advice of those that are experiencing difficulties in relationships, there are so many beautiful girls out there. Let's be practical. It's not only that one that you're having difficulties with. In fact,
I think that is oversimplifying the matter.
I mean,
don't you agree, Mr. Alenga?
Instead of
I like your sober thoughts on this one, Mr. Alenga.
Instead of killing one another, I would rather
just move on.
Just leave and go.
Mr. Alenga, is it that simple?
I think
you can speak from personal experience.
I think bottom line is how we deal with loss and rejection and the end of some things. So it does not mean that if my relationship with you ends, then we both have to leave the face of earth.
Yeah.
I mean, but that is, I think it comes from training on how to be able to accept certain things.
Yes, but in these moments of conflict, I don't think the issue of you can simply replace this other person is a viable solution. You know, in these moments, and you know, we're talking about a family setup with 3 children who are sitting there waiting to be given food. I mean...
But what's the easiest to do? Is it to wait and be killed, or to move on? And there are so many people who have moved, and I'm not advocating for divorce or breaking of these families, but I'm just saying that up to you, before this happened, and like we are being told, already I think the lady has already seen some of these red flags, and they were aware perhaps there could be something that would happen. So in such an environment, you can always have an option B, which is to walk away, or even the man can just walk away from such a relationship. It doesn't mean because you've
we should not stay in
then you should not move on.
Yeah, we should not stay in toxic environments. That is true. I agree with that. We're going to take a short break. On the other side, we shall get the female perspective and also on the administrative perspective of Dr. Pamela Odhiambo, woman representative from Migori. Our guests shall continue on with us. Do stay tuned on Morning Express. We have much more for you.